Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in the area of Microsoft 365 development. And I have a lot of experience with SharePoint development, including all of the different development models that we've had, Microsoft Graph development, Microsoft Teams development, and developing add-ins for Microsoft Office, as well as working with Microsoft Identity, including Azure AD. Developers can create Microsoft Teams app to create new experiences for their users and integrate with existing business solutions. When custom applications need to access user information protected by Azure AD and data from other services, apps will need to establish a trusted connection with these providers. So in this module, you're going to learn about the different authentication flows that are supported by Microsoft Teams that you can use in your custom apps. We're going to focus on single sign-on though. In this first unit, that you're going to learn about the different authentications supported by Microsoft Teams and how the single sign-on process is going to work with custom tabs and custom bots. So there's three things we're going to cover in this very first section: authentication and authorization in Microsoft Teams apps, Microsoft Teams and single sign-on, and then how to implement single sign-on in Microsoft Teams apps. So let's get started. In Microsoft Teams, there are two different authentication flows for the app. You can perform a traditional web-based authentication flow in a content page that's embedded in a tab or a configuration page or a task module. And if the app contains a conversational bot, you can use the OAuth prompt flow and optionally the Azure Bot Framework's token service to authenticate a user as part of a conversation. And you can require that users be logged in with a Microsoft account or a work and school account. This task is called user authentication because it enables the app to know who the user is. Your app can also get a user's consent to access their Microsoft Graph data, such as their Microsoft 365 profile, OneDrive files, and SharePoint data, to name a few, or other data in other external sources such as Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, Salesforce, and GitHub. This task is called app authorization because the app is being authorized, not so much the user. Now, the web-based authentication flow for tabs, you can use that and choose to use it with your conversational bots or your messaging extensions. You can use the Microsoft Teams JavaScript client SDK in a web content page to enable authentication. And then after enabling authentication, you can embed the content page within a tab, a configuration page, or a task module. Now, the Bot Framework's OAuth prompt makes authentication easier for apps using conversational bots. You can use the Azure Bot Framework's token service to assist with the token caching. Now let's talk a little bit about Microsoft Teams and single sign-on. Now, Microsoft added support for single sign-on to Microsoft Teams in 2020, and this capability reduced how often a user is prompted to log into third-party services. The way that the SSO support is implemented in combination with your code in your custom apps and in Azure AD, and to support SSO, a Microsoft Teams app must have a corresponding Azure AD application registration. This application registration defines what permissions the app supports and trusts the Microsoft Teams client applications to do and act for on behalf of that user. Using the support for SSO, apps can request the user's profile information or information from Microsoft Graph. Users can consent to Microsoft Teams apps for themselves to allow the app to obtain their profile information. The app can then use this profile information provided by Azure AD and Microsoft Teams as the ID of the currently signed in user. Administrators can then consent for an entire organization via centralized deployment processes, so each user doesn't have to individually go through the consent process. Microsoft Teams SSO supports both types of accounts supported by Microsoft: work and school accounts and Azure AD accounts, and Microsoft accounts, or MSAs. Now, to implement SSO in Microsoft Teams apps, this is supported in both tabs and bots. Now, the implementation and the specifics of how it works is going to differ a little bit between the two because tabs are rooted in a web experience with user interaction, while bots are really entirely service-driven. So each of these two types of customizations that support SSO share common characteristics, specifically with the Azure AD application that is used to identify the user. For a Microsoft Teams app to support SSO, you must do the three following things. You have to register the Azure AD application, you've got to associate the Teams app with an Azure AD application, and then you have to implement the code in the tab or the bot to obtain an access token from Microsoft Teams. So let's look at each one of these things individually, and we'll start with registering an Azure AD application. The first step is to register an Azure AD application for the Microsoft Teams app. Now, the developer tools provided by Microsoft include a process that will register the Azure AD application with all the required settings during your development process. And like most Azure AD applications, your app is going to need to authenticate with Azure AD using a client ID and either a client certificate or a client secret. You'll also need to specify a redirect URL where Azure AD should send the access token upon a successful authentication. The value for this URL will differ depending if you're creating a tab or a bot. So that's what you see there in the lower left of the slide. That's for a tab. Now, the Azure AD applications used to support SSO and Microsoft Teams have many requirements. And for example, they must be multi-tenant applications. They should also expose the access as user permission that you see there, or that scope that I'm defining on the far right side of the slide. And then you should also trust all the Microsoft Teams client applications that are going to call the app. And the reason why you do this, as you're going to see in the demo, is because you want to make sure that all of the Microsoft Teams clients have the permission to automatically act as the user if the user is signing in. And what that basically says is that your user is not going to be prompted to say, let Microsoft Teams act as me when I'm signing in, because you're using the app, so that kind of already is implied. Creating and configuring this permission, you do that in the Expose API section of the Azure AD app configuration. That's the little sub screenshot that you see there on the far right-hand side. Here you can see I'm specifying a unique URI for the application in the format of API//domain and then the GUID of the app. Now, when you add the permissions and optionally trusting existing clients to call this app, that's what I'm doing after I've gone through and I've created this new scope. When you automatically trust the client apps, as I mentioned a second ago, such as the Microsoft Teams desktop, mobile, and web clients, Azure AD is not going to require the user to consent the application this permission. Now, to configure the Azure AD application to trust the Microsoft Teams clients, add them to the app as pre-authorized applications by their IDs and trust the access as user permission. And when it comes to Microsoft Teams, I don't show it here on the slide, there are two things that you're definitely going to want to specify. The first one is for the Teams mobile and desktop clients, and the second one is for the web clients. These values are GUIDs. I'm not going to show them on the slide, but you'll see them when we jump into the demo in just a minute. And plus, they're also well documented, both in the Microsoft Teams documentation, but also inside this module. Now, once you've created that Azure AD application, you have to associate it with the Microsoft Teams app. And this is going to be done in the app's manifest.json file. Specifically, it's going to be down at the bottom of the file usually, and it's in the web application info object. There are two parts to this. The first one is the ID, and that's the client ID or the application ID of the Azure AD application. The resource property is the URL of the app, which is the same thing as the URI that was used when registering the app in Azure AD. This is the domain portion of this of the URI must also be listed in the valid domains array in the app's manifest. So as you see here on the slide where it says app.com, that should be listed in the valid domains. Now, this is what it looks like for a tab. When I do this with a bot, it should instead say bot ID dash and then the GUID of the app. It's a little bit different, a little bit of a difference between tabs and bots. Now, in this first demo, in this module, we're actually focusing on implementing SSO for both tabs and bots. So I'm going to do a demo on tabs. I'm going to do a demo on bots. And while the Microsoft Teams Toolkit, both the Visual Studio version and the Visual Studio Code version, they can register an Azure Active Directory application for when you choose that you want to do a single sign-in project. But you really should know how to do this manually because you should know all the different pieces that are being done for you. So in this first demo, you're going to learn how to manually register and configure the Azure AD app that can be used to implement single sign-on in a Microsoft Teams app to better understand all the required settings. So let's go ahead and dive into the demo. Now, Microsoft Teams Toolkit can be used to register an Azure Active Directory application for a single sign-on project. However, in this demo, what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to manually register and configure the Azure AD app that can be used to implement SSO in a Microsoft Teams app. And I'm going to do this because you need to have a good understanding of all of the different settings and properties and such that you will have to do when you want to create one of these in production when you're not using like the toolkit in development. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out by logging into our Azure AD portal, and I've already done that. And then I'm going to select the Azure Active Directory. Now, from here, I'm going to go to my app registrations. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a brand new registration. So I'm going to say new registration, and I'm going to give it the name of my Teams SSO app. I'm then going to select, I want this to be a multi-tenant app, and then I need to specify a redirect URI. Now, this value here has to be a fully qualified URL that Azure Active Directory can redirect my user back to. So in the case of different single sign-on things with Microsoft Teams, this cannot be a local host account. It also has to be HTTPS. So what we're using is we're going to use a tool called ngrok to create a secure tunnel that's going to redirect back to our local web server that we're going to run on localhost. And what this is going to do is give us a fully qualified URL that we can use. Now, when you normally create start the tool ngrok, it normally is going to give you a dynamic URL. So if I come over here and say ngrok HTTP 3000 or HTTPS localhost 3000, so what that would do is that says open up an HTTP tunnel to the endpoint on my local machine, localhost 3000. And if I normally run that, what that's going to end up doing is that's going to spin up a new domain and redirect to a new domain on my machine. So you see here that I get this HTTPS URL that's a fully routable URL, and any requests to that URL are going to be redirected over here to localhost. Now, the challenge with this, ngrok is a free tool. It's absolutely fantastic, but the free tool has a limitation in the sense that this URL, the subdomain, changes every time you start and stop ngrok. So here you can see mine starts with 84 DEA. If I go ahead and close this and then I spin it up again, you're going to see we're going to get yet another subdomain when I run this. So here we can see we get a totally different subdomain now when I run this. Now, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The challenge is that when you're working with Azure AD, and as we're going to do throughout this module in this screencast, I'm going to have an Azure Active Directory app. We're going to eventually get to creating a bot as well that we're going to host on our local web server, as well as register it with the Bot Framework in Azure. And anytime that subdomain changes, I'm going to have to go to a lot of places to change that value. So that's fine. You can do that. You can also spin up ngrok and leave it running the entire time we're doing this demo, even if the local web server is starting and stopping. Now, that dynamic subdomain, we can totally use that if we want to use that in the free account. But I want to show you that I'm going to use a paid account that I use personally. But what I like about this is that I can reserve a subdomain that is only available to my account that I've logged into. And so I can reuse the same thing over and over. And so with that, I'll do the same command as to spin up ngrok and open up an HTTP endpoint that points to localhost 3000, but I can have a subdomain that I've registered, which is just my name. And so you see here that now whenever I go to andrewconnell.ngrok.io, that is always going to go to my localhost. Nobody else can use this subdomain. This is reserved for me and my ngrok account. It's just an option if you go with a paid plan, and it's going to make my demo a little bit easier than having to jump around and have to reset URLs in different places. So I'm going to leave this as is for right now. But just know that whenever you see me work with these different redirect URIs, you're going to need to make sure that you pay attention and use the subdomain for the dynamic subdomain if you're using the free ngrok account, or you can use your own subdomain if you have a paid ngrok account. So I'm going to say https andrewconnell.ngrok.io/authend. Now that's the redirect URI that we're going to want to use because that's the endpoint that we're going to have on our local web server that the Teams Toolkit is going to spin up for us. So I'll then go ahead and select register to go ahead and create our app. All right, now a couple things you're going to want to pay attention to once the app is created is you're going to want to keep track of the client ID for the app. So here we can see we have our application, otherwise known as our client ID. I'm going to go ahead and save that because that is something that I'm going to want to use. I'm going to need to use in my app. So I'm going to call this my client ID, and I'm also going to have something called a client secret. So we'll get that in a minute. All right, now that I have this, I have the app actually created. Let's go ahead and let's set up the authentication. Now for the authentication, this is where you can set up different platforms that you support. In this case here, I've just got my web platform, but I can add additional redirect URIs if I needed to. But in this case, what I need to do is I need to also grant the implicit grant and tell Azure AD that I want the implicit grant to be able to return access tokens and ID tokens for the implicit grant. So I'll go ahead and save those changes. The next thing we have to do is we need to create a secret. So I'm going to go to Client Certificates and Secrets, and you can use a certificate, which is the more secure way of doing this in a production environment. But for development, I'm just going to create a client secret. Now what this is, think of this as kind of like your password, the app's password. So we have an app username, which is the client ID, and we have the secret, which is like the password. And that's how our app is going to register or connect to Azure AD and authenticate. Now, the next step, we need to set some API permissions. So I'm going to come over here to my API permissions, and we see we have one permission that's already been listed for configured with our app. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a few more. So I'm going to add in the base Microsoft Graph permissions, or specifically some OpenID permissions that are absolutely required for our application for single sign-on. So I'm going to add in email, OpenID, and profile. And I'm also going to add in the offline access as well. And then I'll hit add permissions. And then I have the option here to grant admin consent. And what this does is as an administrator, I can pre-consent on behalf of all of my users these permissions. So they won't be prompted for consent. It's a bit beyond the scope of what we're doing here to get into the whole consent process in Azure AD. So I'm just going to go ahead and for development, I'm going to go ahead and pre-consent to make my life a little bit easier. All right, now the last step is to expose an API. So what am I doing in the exposing of an API? This is allowing me to define a permission or a scope for this app. That's a custom scope that I'm using. And furthermore, I'm going to be able to automatically configure it to trust specific clients that are requesting this permission. So what I need to do first, I need to set the ID URI for my app. Now, it's going to depend, the value that you're going to put here is going to depend if we're doing a Teams tab or if I'm doing a bot that is going to participate in single sign-on. So for now, I know that we're going to do, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to end up doing a Teams tab. So I'm going to use that format. Now with this, what you have to do here is even though we have our app ID, or our ID, and then, we have our prefix of app API : whack, and then the ID of our app. What you also have to do is you have to put in as a prefix to this the domain where it's going to be hosted. So this is again my ngrok URL that I'm going to have in development. Of course, you're going to want to change that that subdomain for your that changes your dynamic subdomain. Now the next step is we're going to add a scope or a permission. Now the permission that we're going to add is something called access as user. And what this does is this is going to say that we're going to grant Microsoft Teams to act on behalf of the current user or act as that user. So who can give this, who can consent to this permission? We'll say admins and users. And then I want to go ahead and give it some nice friendly description. So we'll say Teams can access the user's profile. That's what admins will see, and then users will see can access your profile. And then the description is Teams can call the app's web API as the current user as you. We'll just do those two, and we'll set this to enabled. Now the part of this that's going to be that it gets a little interesting here is this next part where we want to grant these specific apps or pre-consent these specific apps. So these authorized client applications, what I'm going to do is I'm going to configure Microsoft Teams to not be prompted, or the users not be prompted to grant these specific apps this permission. So I'm going to add in one GUID right here. This one right here is for the Microsoft Teams mobile and desktop clients. I'll go ahead and check that off. And then the second one that we're going to have is for the Teams web client. Now, these GUIDs, you have to use these specific GUIDs. They are well documented in the Microsoft Teams SSO documentation, but you'll also find them in the exercise that goes along with this demo for the Microsoft Learning module that accompanies this screencast. So you'll find those documented as well. All right, now everything here is good. So I'll go ahead and our app is all configured. And one of the things I can do from here is that I'm going to need to make sure and just use the application ID and potentially the redirect URI that we have defined right here. I'm going to need to use those values whenever I do any work inside of my Microsoft Teams Toolkit based app when it asks for those domains. So with that, everything has now been configured for our Azure AD app, and we can go ahead and start creating our single sign-on tab or single sign-on bot. We're going to look at that in a future demo. Now, developers can create custom tabs in Microsoft Teams that display information using Microsoft Graph. And because users are going to sign into Microsoft Teams via their Azure AD Active Directory accounts in Microsoft 365, developers can take advantage of this by implementing a single sign-on process to authorize the tab for your users. Now, if a user consents to use your app, they don't have to consent again on another device because they're automatically signed in across all of the Microsoft Teams devices. In addition, your access token is going to be prefetched by Microsoft Teams, and that's going to help you improve the performance and load times. So what are we going to look at in this unit? We're going to look at three things: understanding the SSO authentication flow, how to configure the Azure AD application for single sign-on with Microsoft Teams tabs, how to implement SSO in Microsoft Teams tabs as well. So we're going to learn how SSO works and how to create a Microsoft Teams tab that uses single sign-on. So let's get started. We're going to start with first how the single sign-on process works at runtime with Teams tabs. So we're going to look at in just a minute how Microsoft Teams SSO actually works. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about Microsoft Teams as it relates to Microsoft Graph. Now, it's worth noting that Microsoft Teams can only prompt for consent for one permission scope. It's called the profile scope, and it's an OpenID scope or permission. Microsoft Teams can't prompt the user to consent to any Microsoft Graph permissions. Now, this can actually produce a challenge with your app because your app can't know if that initial token that it gets back, what we call a bootstrap token, we can't know if that token can be used in what's called the on behalf of OAuth flow to obtain an access token for Microsoft Graph, because that token is going to be retrieved and then that token has to be exchanged for a token that can be used by Microsoft Teams to call Microsoft Graph to act on behalf of the current user. And if your code needs permissions to talk to Microsoft Graph or more permissions that the user hasn't consented to yet, when Microsoft Graph receives that bootstrap token from Teams, it's actually going to fail because it's going to fail with a very specific error code. I believe it's AAD-STS 65001. It's documented, so don't worry about writing that down. This error code indicates that consent to the requested graph permissions has not been granted yet. And that's not really ideal because when you get that error, you then need to figure out a way in your app to prompt your users to go consent to that permission. So you should be, in your code, you should handle if you receive that error, and you should handle it gracefully with a scenario and a fallback authorization system that's going to prompt the user to consent to the necessary Microsoft Graph permissions. Now, the way you're going to do that, and as you'll see in the code when we look at it in the demo, is that it's a better approach to kind of fall back to the old style of the authentication, which is to present a pop-up or a dialog. And what that will do is that will allow you to have the user be redirected to Azure AD to consent to these additional permissions. All right, so let's look at how SSO actually works. All right, so this is first the process of obtaining what I just referred to a second ago as the bootstrap token, which is that very first token that's going to be used to exchange to get a Microsoft Graph token. So we're going to start with step number 1. So you can see I'm inside of my tab. And in that tab, I'm going to have a JavaScript call that's going to be made to a method called getAuthToken. That is from the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK. This tells Teams to obtain an authentication token for the tab app. The second step is that if this is the first time the current user has used the tab application, there's going to be a request prompt to consent if consent is required to handle the step-up authentication, such as things like if I did multi-factor or two-factor authentication. Then in step 3, Microsoft Teams is going to request the tab application token from Azure AD's endpoint for the current user, and Azure AD is going to send that back to the tab application in Microsoft Teams. Now, Microsoft Teams is actually what the Teams app is doing is then in step 5, it's going to send the tab application token to the tab as part of the result object returned by the getAuth token. And then in step 6, the token is then parsed by the tab application using JavaScript to extract the required information, such as the user's email address. If I wanted to use this tab with Microsoft Graph, well, then I would have to then take that tab and submit it to Microsoft Graph and exchange it for another token that can be used with Graph. And you'll see that when we do that in the demo in just a minute. The code that's created by the Teams Toolkit does this stuff for us, or it stubs out this code for us. Okay, so we've already seen how we have to associate our Azure AD app with our Teams app using the manifest file and that web application info object in our Teams manifest. So let's now skip to talking ahead about in our code about how are we going to get an ID token for Microsoft Teams. This ID token, this is what I'm also referring to as like a bootstrap token, because that's what's going to be used to start the process of obtaining a token for use within Microsoft Graph. So again, this token is commonly referred to as a bootstrap token because it only contains details that are used to identify the currently signed in user. It does not contain any permissions that can be used to call Microsoft Graph. To obtain this ID token, you're going to use the Microsoft Teams SDK authentication object. So you can see there on the right half of the slide, we're working with the Teams JavaScript API. Now, the result object that is being passed into the success callback method is going to contain the access token that's been returned by Azure AD. This token can be used to identify the user within my tab or my own backend system. Now, if I use this token in my own API, I should implement that accepted best practices when I'm forwarding a token that's been received from Microsoft Teams. And that includes validating the token to ensure it was created by Azure AD, that it's from the expected authority, and that the app is in the intended audience of the token. The token has not expired, and that the scope has been set to access as user, as we saw when we created our app. Now, what if I want to use this token for use with Microsoft Graph? So when you want to submit requests to Microsoft Graph from your tab, I'm going to need to obtain an access token from Azure AD to include in my requests to Microsoft Graph. So the Microsoft Graph access token is obtained from Azure AD by exchanging the initial ID token that's received by Microsoft Teams. That access token, which is obtained using the OAuth 2 on behalf of flow, you can see that in the request that I have down there and at the bottom of the slide, the requested token use is for on behalf of. Now that request, this must be done server side. So I'm going to have to create some sort of a server side API that receives that ID or bootstrap token and uses that as that token is what you see there in this slide. It's where it says the SSO ID token. That's the ID token or the bootstrap token that I'm going to be requesting from Azure AD as a new token for Microsoft Graph using the on behalf of flow. So some of the requirements of this are as follows. So the grant type, it must equal that string that you see there, that long URN, IETF, all the way down to the JWT bearer. The assertion is the ID token itself. So that's the actual token that I received as part of the initial bootstrap token I got as part of the SSO process. The requested use for that token must be on behalf of, and the scope should list out in a space delimited list all the permissions that I need in order to call Microsoft Graph. And then you see there on the top line that you see there, I have the client ID and the client secret. That's to identify my Azure AD app that I've registered associated with my app. This request is going to be sent to the token endpoint, which is the /token endpoint for my specific tenant. The tenant ID that I get back, where you see it listed there, is tenant-ID in the curly brackets. I can actually get that value from the TID claim that's included in the ID token that's received from Teams as the initial bootstrap token. Now, when I submit this request, Azure AD is going to respond with a valid access token if the user's consented to the requested permissions, if they need to consent to more permissions, or if the user must perform another authentication step, such as multi-factor auth. Azure AD is going to respond to this request that I submit with either an interaction required error or an invalid grant error. And that's the case I was talking about earlier, where I should make sure I have a good failback authentication system, that I should open up a dialog and redirect the user for the same request to grant those permissions to Microsoft Graph before I go resubmit this request for the token. Now, the Microsoft Teams Toolkit does contain some project templates for setting up and creating a tab with single sign-on. Includes both the JavaScript and a TypeScript project template. What this will also do is it'll also prompt you for some details about your Azure AD app that you want to create, what your directory is, and it's also going to prompt you to sign in as well. And what that's going to do is it's going to automatically create the Azure AD application, and then it's also going to populate some values in a project that it's going to create for you using the client ID and the client secret that you specified. It's also going to include a server-side API project that's going to handle the exchange of the ID token in return for an access token we can use to call Microsoft Graph. So this thing really creates two projects inside of it. It's going to create two projects going to run on two different web servers. One of them is a server-side API to do that token exchange. And the other one is it's creating a React application using the Create React App popular tool. And it's going to host that on a different site or on a different port. But it uses a little proxy to go through and to host that. So you'll see how that works when we dive into the demo. So speaking of the demo, what we're going to do here is we're going to add a custom tab to our existing Microsoft Teams app, and we're going to use single sign-on to obtain an access token to submit requests to Microsoft Graph. So let's go ahead and get started. In this demo, we are going to create a new Microsoft Teams project, a new Microsoft Teams app, and we're going to use the Visual Studio Code Teams Toolkit to create a custom tab that is going to be configured for SSO to submit requests to Microsoft Graph. There are a couple prerequisites you need to have to be able to do this. You need to have things like Node installed and a tool called ngrok, maybe an editor like VS Code, and then also the Teams Toolkit for VS Code. For a list of all of the dependencies, the versions, and how to install everything, refer to the exercise in the hands-on lab in the module that accompanies this screencast. This is the second demo, so this would be the second exercise you come to in that module. So I'm going to start by creating a new Microsoft Teams app project. So I'm going to do that by selecting the Teams Toolkit here in the left rail of VS Code. I've already got this extension installed in my Visual Studio Code install. And I'm going to choose the create a new Teams app. Now the first thing it does is it says it wants to sign in. And what it needs to do is it needs you to sign in using your Azure AD credentials so that it can create the Microsoft Teams app inside of the Microsoft Teams App Store for your tenant. Furthermore, it's also used for updating the app as you make changes to it. So I'm going to go ahead and select Allow. And in another browser window, I just have to go make sure that I go Authenticate, which is what I've already done. All right, now, the next thing that we have here is we get a prompt for all the different types of projects that we can create. So here, what I'm going to do is we're going to use this channel and group app with single sign-on SSO. So I'm going to choose this option. I'm going to choose the TypeScript option, and I'm going to have to go ahead and create my project now by using the configure project dialog. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and set the name of my app to my SSO tab, and my single sign-on domain. Well, as we talked about in the previous demo, this is going to have to be a fully routable URL that's also supported or also served up via HTTPS. A common way to do that in development is use a tool called ngrok, which is what I'm using. But we also have that the dynamic subdomains if we're using the free account. As I showed you in the previous version or in the previous demo, I'm going to use my paid account just so that I can keep the same subdomain throughout this entire screencast. But you need to make sure that either if you don't have a paid account, that whatever subdomain you use, you've spun up ngrok before starting this exercise or before starting this demo. And then everywhere that domain is used, you need to make sure that you go update that if the subdomain changes when you start and stop the ngrok app. So I'm going to go ahead and select register. This is going to sign in or use the Azure Active Directory support in the Teams Toolkit to go create a new Azure AD app, giving it a new client ID, giving it a setting the redirect URI, setting any permissions, and setting the client secret as well. I'm going to go ahead and grab some of this stuff because I know that some of these things are some values that I'm going to want to keep track of. So I'll grab the ID for the app, and I'm also going to go ahead and grab this password as well. All right. So the app that it just created is basically the exact same app that was created that we created in the previous demo. I just wanted you to see the manual process of doing that because that's something you would have to do if you're deploying this from your developer environment over to, say, a production tenant. All right. So now let's go ahead. We can close this, and we can also go ahead and close this. And let's take a look at what we have here. So here in the API server, I have this environment variable, and you can see that it's setting the client ID and secret to what we were just using a second ago. This API server project is what's going to be used by our tab to pass the initial token that's received, the ID token from Azure AD, and it's going to use that token to then submit a request to Azure AD for using the on behalf of flow to obtain a access token to call Microsoft Graph. That's not something we can do client side. That's something that can only be done server side. So that's why we're using that. Now, another thing that we're doing is we also have the source folder right here. This source folder is what's going to contain our main tab that we're going to show inside Microsoft Teams. This is created using the Create React App utility. And so we're going to do a lot of our work just inside of the component section for this. So effectively, this entire VS Code project is two sub-projects inside of it. We're going to have our React app that's going to run from a web server that spins up this section, and we're going to have an API server that spins up over here as well. All right. If I come over here and I look at this package JSON, what you'll see down here is something that the Create React app uses is a proxy. And it just is simply saying that when we try to go to our local host for anything on like port 5000, that we're going to want that to appear also on the same URL. So even though the API server is going to spin up on port 4000, it is going to respond on our as a locally hosted app inside the same web server as the Create React app is going to spin up. The next thing we want to look at is let's take a look at the app package. So in this folder right here, we've got our manifest.json. And what I want you to take notice of here is down here is this section called Web Application Info. This has the ID set of our Azure AD app, and it also has the full app ID URI listed in the resource section as well. That is what's going to tie the Microsoft Teams app to the Azure AD app to support single sign-on. So why don't we make sure that all of this stuff works before we get started? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to spin up. We're going to need 2 tabs here. One of them, we're going to have to go into our first project. So cd play my SSO tab. And we're going to have to do an npm install from the root. And then I'm also going to want to go into the API server, and I'm going to have to do the same thing because it has its own. I'm going to wait for the top one to finish, and then I'm going to run the second one. All right, now that the npm install part is finished on our web server we're going to use for the Create React app, I now need to do the same thing for my API server. So I'll do an npm install on that one as well, and we'll wait for that to finish. Okay, fantastic. So now both of them have all the dependencies installed. So what I can do now is I'm going to do an npm start on my local web server. And I'm also going to do the same thing on the API server. All right, so we can see our API server is up and running. We're waiting for the web server for the Create React app to be configured as well. So we'll wait for that to finish. Now let's go ahead and let's spin up ngrok. So I'm going to say ngrok, open up an HTTP process, HTTPS, localhost 3000, and I want to use the subdomain Andrew Connell because that's what we're using for everything else. Okay, so now I have this URL that's going to redirect to our local web server. And again, we have that proxy set up, so any requests to port 5000 are going to stay on the same, are going to be redirected over to port 3000 as well. All right, so now let's go try out our project. So now I'm going to switch over to the browser. What we're going to see if I go over here and look at all of my apps, if I look at the ones that are built for Contoso, we don't see our app listed here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my apps. I'm going to choose upload a custom app. So I'll upload it for me and my teams. And we're going to find the app that we just created in our project. So it's my SSO tab. And then I'm going to say, let's go ahead and let's add it to a team. Now I'm going to choose my test team that I have, put this in the general channel, and I'll say, go ahead and set up the tab. And we can see some requests coming back over here on ngrok. We'll actually watch this on the main one because we'll leave ngrok running the whole time we're doing this demo. And here we can see a tab configuration page. We don't have any configuration information for it. So I'm just going to go ahead and click save. And what I should see is my new tab get added, and we did not have pop-ups turned on. So let me go ahead and allow pop-ups. I have to try this again. So let's leave this and we'll come back to our tab. And so the first thing we're getting is this consent request. This is because we had not automatically granted consent to this app. Remember, in the first demo for our screencast, we went and created a new app manually using Azure Active Directory's admin portal. And then when I granted it all the permissions, I then did the admin consent on behalf of all users. But when we did this for the Teams Toolkit, the Teams Toolkit did not grant that admin consent. So this is something that I have to do. This part of just checking this box and then saying accept is basically doing the same thing as granting admin consent through the Azure AD portal. I just did it through the consent experience. And that was the pop-up error that we got initially because I didn't have pop-ups turned on for this domain. And here what we can see is where we are successfully doing single sign-on and calling Microsoft Graph, because what this code has done is this went and reached into it logged in as the current user, obtained an ID token for the current user, which my current user is Megan. We're signed in as Megan, as you can see here. And then it used that to call the local API server and request an access token for Microsoft Graph. And then the tab used that access token to call Microsoft Graph, get the profile information, specifically the profile picture for the current user. So let's modify our tab and let's change it so that the out-of-the-box code is no longer just pulling the image for the currently logged in user. Let's also have it display a list of all of my upcoming meetings using Microsoft Graph as well. Now to do this, I'm going to need to go in and give my app in Azure AD more permissions. So I'm going to come back over here to a list of all of my apps. So my Teams SSO app, we're going to need to refresh this because we know we have a new app as well. So I'll come over back to Azure AD, app registrations, and there we go. We're on our our Teams Toolkit SSO tab. So I'm going to want to go to my API permissions, and we're going to grant it a new permission, a delegated permission of mail.read. Mail.read. There we go. Add permissions. Now, just so we don't have to deal with that consent anymore, I'm going to go ahead and just grant admin consent on behalf of all users. You can see the one that we had to grant earlier through the pop-up is showing up down here. So I'm going to go ahead and just bypass that by going ahead and granting consent for everybody. All right, now the next step is let's go modify the code for our project. So what I'm going to do is come over here and I'm going to find our tab component, and I'm going to go make a few changes to this. So first, I'm going to add in a list component from the Fluent UI library to make it easier for me to add a list of information. I'm also going to come into the state for the tab for a React component. I'm going to add in a recent mail array, and I'm going to go ahead and initialize this to be an empty array. Now furthermore, I now need to go in and go fetch some data. So let's scroll down to right after the component update method. There we go, component did update. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a new method right here, paste this in, that says get users recent mail. And so what this is going to do is this is going to use Microsoft Graph to call the messages endpoint and get the receive date and the subject for all my emails. Specifically, I only want the top 10, and I want to sort them by the receive time. The request parameters I'm going to use, it's going to be an HTTP GET. I'm going to pass in the authorization value, and then I'm going to issue the request to Microsoft Graph using the Fetch API in the browser, using this endpoint and these parameters. And when I get the results back, I'm going to set the state's recent mail property to the value property of the response that comes back. That is the response that comes back is a JSON object in the body. So I'm going to process the JSON that you see right here. And then the value property is an array of all of my recent messages. So to make sure that this is going to be called, I'm going to go ahead and grab this and I'm going to put this in the component did update, which is going to be called when the component is initialized or when it first loads on the page. So now we're going to have all of our information. And now what I want to do is come down to where everything is rendered to go control how this is going to look. So what I'm going to do is right here after it grabs the profile picture for the user, I'm going to say let the recent mails equal to this dot state dot recent mail. And what I want to do is I want to make this to be a ternary expression or an if statement to say whenever the length is greater than 0, I want you to do the following. So when it is equal to 0, then I want this to remain as an empty array. So I'm going to say let's convert the data that we get back from Microsoft Teams or from Microsoft Graph, and let's convert it to something that list component, React component that we just imported a moment ago, that it understands. So I can just easily bind the data. So I'm going to do that by saying, let's look at the current state, recent mail, and let's use a map function. And what this map function is going to do we want to go like this and then like this there. And what this map function is going to do is it's going to return back a new object. We're basically just going to translate it. So we want 3 properties. We want a key property, and that key property is going to be set to the mail's ID property. We want a header property. That's going to be set to the mail's subject property. And then we also want a header media property, and I want that set to the mail.received date time. Let's make sure I type that out correctly. Received date time. Yep. Okay, that looks good. All right, now the last thing is let's use it. So I'll come down here just past the avatar and I'll say your recent mails. And what I'll do is I'll add in our list and bind his items collection equal to recent mails. Right? And so that's this right here. So what happens? When the component loads on the page, and it's going to go through the lifecycle method of the React lifecycle method of component did update. If I have a graph access token, it's going to call getting graph client, and then it's going to call get user's recent email. So this call graph client that you see here, that's what's going to add the avatar. The second one is going to get all of the recent emails of the current user. Those are added to the recent mail property on the component state. Whenever the state changes, the render method is going to rerun. So here we go on the render method. This is going to say whenever you have any mail that's been returned on the state property of recent mail, then I want you to convert it to an object or an array of objects that I can bind to this list component. So let's see this in action. I'm going to save my changes. We can see that I can see in the background that actually a rebuild happened over here. So I don't need to go through and reload anything. I just can let's come back over here to our web app, and we can see it's already reloaded the page for us. So actually let's come off that page so we can see it run. I'm going to go back to our tab, my tab, and what we can see here is all of our recent mails are now showing up down here because we've called Microsoft Graph to get a list of all of the recent emails. And that's pretty cool, right? So it's been really easy to go through and to fetch more information from Microsoft Graph using this single sign-in process. And I didn't have to do anything extra or special to sign in. The user was automatically signed in using their current token they had in Microsoft Teams. Now, developers can create bots for Microsoft Teams that display user information using Microsoft Graph. And because users are going to sign into Microsoft Teams using their Azure AD accounts if they're in Microsoft 365, you as a developer, you can take advantage of this by implementing single sign-on to authorize the bot. Now, single sign-on authentication in Azure AD is going to minimize the number of times that users need to enter their credentials by silently refreshing the authentication token. If the users agree to use your app, they are not going to need to provide consent again and again and again between different devices because Teams is going to automatically sign them in. The flow is going to be similar to how the Teams tab SSO support works. However, because the bots are more service-oriented, there's going to be a little bit of a difference in the protocol for how a bot is going to request and receive responses. So in this section of the module, we are going to talk about how SSO works and how to create a conversational bot for Microsoft Teams that leverages SSO. So we are specifically going to look at three things. We're going to understand the SSO authentication flow for bots. We're going to configure an Azure AD application for SSO with bots because there's a little bit of a difference when it comes to bots and Teams. And then we're going to configure the bot's OAuth connection settings. So let's go ahead and let's first start with understanding SSO with Teams bots. So the first step that we're going to have, you see our bot over there on the far right-hand side. We got Azure AD, and we've also got the sign-in consent pages over there on the far left, and we have Teams in the middle. So it starts with step one, and the step one is that our bot is going to send a message with an OAuth card that contains a token exchange resource property. Now that's going to tell Microsoft Teams to obtain an authentication token for the bot application. The user receives messages about the active user endpoints. Or the user is going to receive messages at all the active user endpoints. Now, a couple little things to note here. First of all, a user can have more than one active endpoint at any given time. The bot token is received from every active user endpoint, and the app must be installed in the personal scope for SSO support. The second step is going to be that the current user that's using your bot application, at the very first time, a request prompt is going to be displayed that's going to request the user to do one of the following things. They're either going to provide consent if necessary, or they're going to handle the step-up authentication, which is, again, like tabs, that's like multi-factor or two-factor auth. In step three, Teams is going to then request the bot application token from the Azure AD endpoint for the current user. In step four, Azure AD is going to send the bot application token to the Teams application. And then step five, Teams is then going to send the token to the bot as part of the value object that's returned by the invoke activity with the name sign-in / token exchange. And in the last step, in step 6, the parse token is then going, the parse token in the bot application is going to provide all the required information, such as the user's email address that the bot needs for the authentication. Let's talk about the configuration process for bots when it comes to SSO. Every app that's going to implement SSO is also going to have an associated Azure AD app registered. We saw that with tabs. Now, the Azure AD app that's used for bot SSO shares a lot of the characteristics that we had with a tab SSO setup. For example, all Azure AD apps within Microsoft Teams SSO, they're going to have the following things. They have to have a client ID and a client secret or certificate. These are going to be used for your app to authenticate with Azure AD. It's going to have permissions. This is a list of all the API permissions your app needs the user to consent to, such as user.read or mail.read. It's going to need to obtain tokens with the OAuth 2 implicit flow. So Teams must be able to obtain access tokens and ID tokens. And so you're going to set that up inside of the Azure AD app registration on the authentication page, where you specify you're going to check off access and ID tokens under the implicit grant. And then you're also going to have to define the access as user permission. This permission is exposed by the app registration and is used to grant apps, such as Teams, to act on the user's behalf. And then, again, like you saw with tabs, you're also going to have to go through and to pre-authorize the Teams client to act on the user's behalf. So the setting is going to, again, remove the requirement for users to explicitly consent to allow Teams to act on the user's behalf. So all of these things are shared requirements when you use a tab or a bot. But there are some unique things that you have to deal with as well. And that's what I'm talking about on this slide. So bots are a little bit unique because they're server-side interactive experience compared to the client-side nature of tabs. So for example, the redirect URI for the Azure AD app registration, this should point to the Bot Framework's token endpoint. And so you see that here, the token.botframework.com/auth/web/redirect. In addition, when you're exposing the API permission access as user, the Azure AD application ID URI should include the string bot ID dash instead of the domain when we were using tabs for wherever the bot is being hosted. So here you can see that instead of where it says bot ID, where I used to have a tab or the domain / and then the GUID of the actual app, for a tab, I'm using bot ID right here instead. Now there's some other work that we have to do as well. For a bot to support SSO, I'm going to also have to update the bot's OAuth connection settings. And this process associates the bot with the authentication provider, Azure AD. The Azure AD application that's associated with the bot, the application's ID URI, and the permissions the bot needs to obtain an access token for. So this is all done within the bot's screen, the bot settings screen in the bot framework. So here's what this looks like right here. You can see that I'm on my bot configuration page, and then at the bottom you see where I have I can set the connection settings, and here I've defined a new connection setting called My Teams Bot 03 OAuth connection, and I'm specifying the service provider, the Azure AD app that it's associated with, the client secret, the token exchange URL, the tenant ID to use, and all of the different permissions that I want to grant it as well. So what does this experience look like? Well, let's talk a little bit about how this works, or what the experience looks like. First, you can see it here on the slide, but let's talk through this. To request an access token is going to involve submitting an HTTP post message request using an existing message schema. It's included in the attachments of an OAuth card. The schema for the OAuth card class is defined in the Microsoft Bot Schema 4.0, and it's similar to a sign-in card. Now, Microsoft Teams treats the request as a silent token acquisition if the token exchange resource property is populated on the card. For Microsoft Teams channels, only the ID property, which uniquely identifies the token request, is going to be honored. Now, when the user sends a message to the bot for the first time, they must first consent to the application. So Microsoft Teams is going to display a consent experience above the message box. That's what you see in the screenshot on the left. Now, when the user selects continue, the following things are going to happen. First, the bot is going to define, if the bot defines a sign-in button, the sign-in flow for the bot is triggered similar to the sign-in flow for an OAuth card button in the message stream. The developer must decide which permissions to require users' consent. This approach is recommended if you require a token with permissions beyond OpenID, such as the case when you want to call Microsoft Graph, and so you're going to need to exchange the token for an OBO token or on behalf of token. Now, the second thing is that if the second event that's going to happen is that if the bot isn't providing a sign-in button on the OAuth card, user consent is going to be required for a minimal set of permissions. This token is useful for basic authentication to identify the user, for example, to get the user's email address, the identity provider's object ID, and the token user's tenant ID, or the user's display name. Now, when building a bot that requires authentication, an authenticated user, consider using dialogues. This is a bot framework concept. Dialogues can provide a state-based model to manage long-running conversations with the user, and the nature of a sequential conversation that depends on authentication makes dialogues very well suited for this type of a scenario. They simplify the sequential steps of signing in, interacting with the user, and secured resources that require user and bot authorization, and ultimately sign out. So refer to the module if you want some references to the Bot Framework documentation on dialogues and the dialogues library from the Bot Framework SDK. So let's take a look and see kind of how this works or what the code would look like. So this is a simplified version of what we're going to do in the demo, or what the demo is going to help set up, and we're going to walk through in just a minute. So here we're using a waterfall dialogue approach where I'm going to have multiple dialogues that are going to just come one after another. And in this case here, I'm adding a dialogue using the waterfall dialogue that's going to have two things. It's going to prompt, and then it's going to do the login step. So that first prompt step, this is what's going to be presented to the user to sign in if necessary, and then otherwise it's going to request a token. Now the login step was the second step that we were just looking at. And what this login step is going to do is it's going to obtain an access token using the bot's authentication support. If this is successful, it's going to use the access token that's obtained from the OAuth process to submit a request to Microsoft Graph to display information returned from Microsoft Graph. As you can see there, in the else statement, after when the authentication is successful, I'm getting a reference to the Microsoft Graph client by passing in the token that I received back to call Microsoft Graph, and then I'm using the Microsoft Graph client to get a reference to my the me object, which is just at the graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me. And then I'm going to, once I get that me object, I'm then going to go send an activity back to Microsoft Teams that's just a string there. It says you're this person, and there's your UPN name as well. And then I'm going to say I'm going to await the end dialogue for this process. And that's what you saw on the slide just a minute ago, where it was showing the entire process work. But the best way to understand how SSO and bots work is to run through a demo. So that's what we're going to do now. In this demo, we're going to add a custom bot to our Teams app and use single sign-on to obtain an access token to submit requests to Microsoft Graph. And when I say we're going to add it to our app, we're going to take our existing Azure AD app and we're going to modify it to work with a bot. Even though the Teams Toolkit is going to create one for us, we're going to go ahead and we're going to use our existing one so you can see the actual changes that need to happen. In this demo, we're going to look at using the single sign-on capability in Microsoft Teams to create a bot that is going to participate in the single sign-on capabilities that we have in Microsoft Teams. So to do this, we're going to leverage some of the stuff that we've already talked about in the previous demos. I'm not going to go over the same ngrok stuff that we talked about previously. Now we're going to start this demo by creating a new Microsoft Teams app project. And for this, I'm going to use the Teams Toolkit like I've done in the past. So I'm going to open up a new Teams app. And we talked about what this prompt is asking us to do. So I'm going to go ahead and do that again. All right, now the next thing we're going to do is we want to create a bot. So I'm going to choose the conversational bot, but SSO quick start. So I'm going to use that. I'm going to say, go ahead and select JavaScript. And the name of my bot, I'm going to call this my SSO bot. And then select finish. And we'll put this inside the same folder I've been doing my other projects with. Okay. Now, if you remember from the very first the very first demo that I ran through in this screencast, we created an app that we manually created this app here called the My Teams SSO app. The second demo that we ran, we let the Teams Toolkit create one for us. But however, we're going to use this one that we created earlier for our bot. So the first thing that we're going to need to do here is I'm going to need to go over here to the expose an API. I'm going to have to make a change for this. Now remember I said that when we set this up, I have to use the subdomain of where this app is going to be hosted. Well, for us, that's not exactly going to work in this case when we're using a bot. Instead, what we have to do to change this is, as a requirement for the bot framework, I need to change this to bot ID equals or dash, bot ID dash, to have the GUID of the actual app. And I'll go ahead and save my changes. Now, the nice thing, that's automatically going to change for my scopes. It's also changing down here for the apps that we've gone ahead and we've authorized. Now, the next thing I need to do is I'm going to have to register the bot with the Azure AD Bot Framework. Now, again, you're going to need to get the URL of where your bot's going to be hosted. And by default, where it's the project that's being created is spinning up a specific port number. So there's a couple things that we're going to want to do here. I need to go in and I need to get the subdomain that's going to be used for my bot when I do the bot registration. And so for that, again, we're going to use the tool ngrok. Now I need to get that subdomain from ngrok because we're going to need that when I register the bot with the bot framework. Now, there's a couple extra parameters you need to put on your ngrok spin-up command or startup command to ensure that it's going to open up the right port. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to start with ngrok opening up an HTTP process, and it's going to expose port 3978, which is the port that our bot framework or our local project is going to open up. And I'm going to use the option of host header rewrite to make sure that it's going to rewrite all of our host headers. However, I'm also going to go ahead and add in the subdomain that I talked about earlier in a previous in one of the previous demos. How I'm using my static one. Again, just like I've talked about in the past, if you're going to use the free version of ngrok and have a dynamic subdomain, you're going to need to keep track of this. All right, now I need to register my bot with the Azure Bot Framework. So what I'm going to do is come over to an Azure subscription that I have. So I'm logged in my Azure account into a valid Azure subscription, and I'm inside of a resource group that I've created called Learn Teams. So what I want to do is I'm going to add in a new resource. And so the resource that I'm going to add is going to be a bot channels registration. So I'll go ahead and I'll create that. I have to enter in a handful of values here. So see, we have to have a bot handle. So I'll call this my Teams bot. Does that work? Is it being used? It's already used. How about 001? That's used. 002, 3. There we go. Teams bot 003 is available. I'm going to use this subscription. I'm going to use the Learn Teams, the location's East US, and I'm going to change to using the F0. That's the free pack, the free tier for the bot framework. So I'm going to get 10,000 messages for free. The next thing I want to specify is the messaging endpoint that I want to redirect my user to, or where my bot's going to be hosted. So that's going to be at HTTPS, and then I want to use my ngrok URL /API/messages. The API/messages is where the bot is going to be, is where the bot endpoint is going to be listening. Okay. Make sure that says messages on the very end. There we go. Okay, it does. All right, nothing else here. Let's see, we're going to go ahead and turn App Insights off for this. Now, the next thing I need to do here is I need to go through and specify the Azure AD app that I want my bot to be tied to. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and select this, and I'm going to choose Create New, because I don't want Azure AD to go ahead and create the app. I want the app already, I'm using an app that I've already created. So I'm going to come back over to our Azure AD portal, which I have over here, and I want to find my app that I was talking about earlier. So that is this app right here. So I'll go ahead and copy this value, and it wants the client secret as well. So I'll go find that, which I remember I saved that. 39, is that the one we're using? There's a client ID. So we're using 39, right? Yep, there's 3927. So I'll use that ID. If you forgot your ID, go create a new secret. Oh, excuse me. If you forgot the password or the client secret, you can just go create a new secret because you won't be able to see it again in the UX. So I'll go ahead and hit OK. And then I'll go ahead and select Create it to go ahead and to create the bot. All right. So now our bot has been created. A couple things we need to do with this. I need to go enable the Microsoft Teams channel for my bot. So I'm going to go to Channels. We'll see we have the default option that's currently enabled is just web chat. So let's add in the Microsoft Teams. I'll just accept all the licensing requirements and terms of service. All right, so there, we'll go back to Channels. All right, let's go to Bot Profile, and then we'll jump over here to Channels. And we can now see Teams is running and it's working just fine. Okay, so we're in good shape. Now, the next thing we have to do is we're gonna have to configure the bot service connection, or specifically the token store for our bot. So I'm gonna go to the Configuration tab. All of this stuff, we don't need to worry about anything right here, but we do need to worry about the OAuth connection settings. We do not have these defined just yet. So what I'm gonna do is come over here and add in my OAuth connection settings, and I have to create a new connection setting. So this is, we call this our My Teams Bot 003, and we'll just call this the OAuth connection. The service provider we're gonna use, that's gonna be Azure Active Directory v2. The client ID, well, we have that value from over here, client ID. The token exchange URL, this is that special URL or URI we have for our app. So I'm gonna come over here, back to our Azure AD app, go to the Expose an API, and I want this value right here. So I'll go ahead and copy that and paste that in. The tenant ID, I can also get that from our bot registration, or from our Azure AD app registration. So I'll come over here to our app registration, and on overview, there's the directory or tenant ID. So I'll grab that value. And then for the scopes, this needs to be a space delimited list of all the permissions that our app is gonna need. So we're gonna need mail.read, open ID, profile, and user.read. Those are all the permissions that are, or scopes that our bot is, the bot framework is going to request an access token for when we request it. So I'll then say save. All right, so we can see our connection is all set up. Now, with the bot registration complete, we can now go back to the bot project and update it to use our new bot registration. So let's come back over here to our project, and I want to locate this environment variable file. So notice here there's some stuff that's missing from this. So what do I need to do? I need to pass in the ID of our app and the ID or the client secret for our app as well that is tied to our bot. Well, remember I have those values up here. Those are from the initial app that we created. So we have that value and we have our password as well. Next, we need the connection name. This is the OAuth connection name that I defined earlier, or that I defined in my bot registration. So that is, if I come over here, there's the connection name right here. So I'll go ahead and grab this connection name and I'll paste him in and save our changes. Now, the next thing we need to do, let's take a look at the manifest for our bot as well. So I'm gonna look at the manifest, and when I scroll down to the very bottom, you can see I have all these to-dos that are all set up of things that I need to go fill in. So first of all, for the bots, this needs to be the ID of our Azure AD app. Well, again, we know what that is. That's this first value right here to tie our bot, our Azure AD app and the bot to our Microsoft Teams app and the Azure AD app. You saw the little pop-up dialog to ask to go ahead and make sure that I'm still authenticated with Azure AD. I just went ahead and selected that and popped that up in another browser window and automatically closed it because I was still logged in. That's updating the app manifest with the app registration inside of Microsoft Teams. So the next thing I need to do is I need to specify the application information. So I know that this value right here, that GUID, is the ID of our Azure AD app, which is also the value that we should see right here, and it's going to be in our resource. And again, we can see that it's going through and making some changes to the app, the registered app. All right, so with that, everything should be good to go. The next thing we need to do is we need to go through and to install all of the dependencies. So what I'll do is I'll come over here and let's install all the dependencies. So that's from our previous demo. We don't need that. This is my bot SSO. And so we will do an npm install and we'll let all of these dependencies get installed. All right, now with that all set up, let's go ahead and start our bot. So I'll say npm start to spin up our local web server. That's going to start up the local web server that's got the API for our bot. What you'll notice is that we can see that it's listing on port HTTP localhost 3978. And if we go back to our ngrok process, we can see that we are also listening on 3978, but the full URL of https andrewconnell.ngrok.io is redirecting over to it. These error messages you see here from the bad gateway, that's because we didn't have our process running when the bot framework was testing to make sure that the bot was actually there. Well, it's time to test it. So let's come over to our Microsoft Teams. Let's go to our apps and let's look at more apps. And let's look at all the apps built for Contoso. So we don't see our app here just yet. So let's go ahead and let's upload a custom app for just me and my teams. And let's use the bot package that we just created, or the app package we just created. So that's our bot, app package, app package. All right, so here's our conversational bot. I'll go ahead and select add. And here we have our bot is installed. You can see we got a request from something over here. There we go. We have our 200 message on this side. Now, you can see that the first thing it says is that it's welcome to the Teams bot. Type anything to get logged in, log out to sign out. So I'm going to say hello. Now what you can see here is the very first thing that came back is it's prompting me to go ahead and authenticate. So it's asking for additional permissions and I need to do this only once for my SSO bot. So I'm going to say continue. So if I select that, we're going to get a consent dialog that's going to pop up. Now this is the part where I have not granted consent to the bot framework to be able to to use my sign-in information. So this is the bot framework requesting consent for that. So I'm going to say, I'm going to consent for me and for everybody else. Notice those three permissions I gave it: read user mail, sign in and read user's profile, and maintain access to your data. That's the offline access. So I'll say accept. And we have an error here with the reply URL. And I'm now remembering that we actually forgot something when we were working with our app registration. There's an extra thing you have to do for your app registration. I'm not pointing to the correct path. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close this for now. Let's come back over to our app registration in Azure AD and let's look at the authentication section. So the problem is this redirect URI. This should not be pointing to our local web server. Instead, this needs to point to the bot framework's token endpoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this value to token.botframework.com/.auth/web/redirect. And then I'm going to save my changes. So token.botframework.com.auth/web/redirect. Okay, so now let's come back over to our bot and let's try this again. So we're going to try and log in one more time. Let's try this again and see if we can figure out what's going on here. So we can see our precondition failed. We're going to open up the consent. It says we're still having trouble signing in. So there must be something wrong with that redirect. Let's come over here and take a look at this. Make sure it's spelled right. Token.botframework. Oh, there's an R missing. Framework. There we go. I'll save my changes again. And let's try this one more time. So we're going to log out again. Right, and now we'll try one more time with hello. There we go. Let's consent. This time it looks like it's going to work. It did work. Fantastic. So what did it do? It went ahead after it consented. It then grabbed the access token or the ID token from Teams that sent it to the bot framework. The bot framework used that token to request another token from Graph using the on behalf of flow to obtain an access token it can use to call Microsoft Graph. It then used that to fetch information about the current person. So example, it grabbed her name, it grabbed her title, and then it also showed her picture as well. We can even select, yes, we want to view the token that it got back. So let's come over to our code and let's take a look at our bot that we implemented. So that's going to be the main dialog. Let's see what this is doing. So what we're doing here is it's first going through and adding in that first dialog about it wants us to go ahead and it wants us to go and sign in. And it's adding that confirmation prompt when the bot is first activated. And that confirmation prompt is what's checking to see, let's make sure to get them logged in. It's using the dialogues as I talked about in the module in the previous part of the screencast, where dialogues are really well suited for an authenticated bot experience to walk through a long-running but sequential process of authenticating, logging in, etc. So one of the things that it's doing is that once I've gone in and I've logged in, come down here and look at the login step so we can see that you're currently logged in. Then it's going to go ahead and show my display name, my principal name, and the job title name. Now you see these different values that it's inserting in here. Well, what it's doing is that it's actually requested the Microsoft Graph client. That's what this is, this simple graph client. It's going ahead and it's requesting it by passing in the token that it received. Once it's created that instance of that client, I can then use the get me to go get information about the current user, just going to the me endpoint. This simple graph client reference is coming from this code that we have here inside of our project. So if I look at simple graph client, what this is doing under get me, what it's doing is it's going through and getting a reference to the graph client. If it doesn't already have one, it creates one. You can see this up here where it's saying initialize using an auth provider using the access token that it received. The access token that was passed in on the constructor that you see right here, if I come back and look at our main dialog, you can see that that's what is being passed in, is the token response that we got from the login process as part of this dialog step. Then you can see we're displaying the photo, or it's creating a base64 entry of the photo. It's using that as a card response using adaptive cards and sending that back to the user. And then it's asking us, do you want to review your token with another confirmation prompt? And then saying it's ending the dialog. If the user then wanted to display the token, that's where it would continue with that dialog process and show the display token, called the display token method, which this is getting yet another step contents back, and it's going to write out the token. So you can see how the bot framework is getting that ID token from Microsoft Teams and using that to go get another access token from Microsoft Graph to call Microsoft Graph.